And I think Yari has kind of slides. Do you want to pop the agenda slide there, Yari?
Did you get that?
No. Do you want to move on to the agenda slide, Yari?
Yes, I am on the agenda slide. How do we get the rest of you on the agenda slide?
I can see the agenda slide. It's Robin here. Yeah.
Okay, I don't, but never mind. Okay, so Yari has the agenda slide. I have it in another window. Does that agenda look okay to people? Do you want to back the agenda in any way? Okay. Take that as this agenda works. And I think that's the introduction I had. If there's no agenda, then Yari can go on to point 2. And the okay, so Yari, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah. So we have been discussing exactly how to progress this work in terms of organization, and I don't want to take up too much time at the top of the call for this part because we have some actual technical stuff to discuss that's more interesting. But we would like to get organized slightly more than we are. And sort of currently the situation is that we have this very informal way of working, which is, I think, great and exactly matches this situation. That we need to explore a little bit, like what should we do? We also have open collaboration, which is, of course, exactly correct for IETF activities. We don't have so much document structure at the moment, which is good for now because we're exploring again. We don't have so much in terms of plans going forward. Maybe it would be good to have a little bit of that, although obviously document structure and so on will tell us more later. We've also observed that not everyone is aware of activities, like people who actually wanted to join this effort were not aware of the meetings and so forth, which is kind of bad. And it's also been a little unclear, like who should call for the meetings and so on, all the practical stuff. It's maybe a little bit bad as well. And Steve and I have discussed this, and we also discussed with the IAB, and it basically seemed to us that work should continue in this exploration mode and informally for now. But we would like to have some organization, whether that's a working group, work item in a working group, slotting IAB program, something else. But if we had something like that, then the practicalities would take care of themselves a little bit better and would be maybe visible in some agenda somewhere, and more people would be aware of what's going on and could join if they wanted to. And we don't, or at least I don't think Stephen has either very strong opinions exactly how to go about this lightweight organization thing. But we do know that since both of us are in the IAB, it would be relatively easy for us to create a new IAB program. And since this seems a little bit like an architecture thing that things are changing in the world, and maybe we should highlight that. That seemed like one possible answer. And so we circulated, as you remember, a charter, which we modified slightly based on feedback. There's a link on the slide, if you can see my slides now, I don't know. But there's a link to the GitHub page with the full charter. I don't want to show the whole thing here on the slide, but I have a slightly abbreviated version just to go through the main points. So the idea here is to have an IAP program, a new IAP program that will be an open venue for analysis of the threat model situation, and it would produce a potential update to TCP 72 that would better match the reality today as we see it. Of course, since we would be an IAB program, we cannot dictate and don't want to dictate anything what the IETF does. So we would only figure out like, this is the background, why we believe a change is needed, and here's a suggestion. And then that would be taken up by IETF, probably modified and so on. And a couple of other points. So obviously, if we want to update this this aspect in BCP 72, this is kind of like a detail in the longer document, and there isn't a lot of space for things to be discussed. So if we want to do a lengthy description of situation or analysis, then that's probably a separate document. So we might produce also background materials. And of course, since we are talking about things like, do we trust these or those endpoints, there's probably going to be different trade-offs in different people's minds. And the idea here is not to dictate that the IETF forever will prefer, these endpoints over others or whatever silly thing that somebody might think, but rather it's just to call attention to, for the protocol designers, that, hey, you have to think about these things. We're not the ones to arbiter for decisions, like what's more important, this or that. But one has to consider these things as well as some things in protocol design. And I would hope that there's interest in this, regardless of your particular perspective on some trade-offs, that there's interest in noting that this is a consideration. And one final thing about the sort of practical things. So this would be indeed an open program, open to all interested parties. Not all IAB programs have been like that. But this would need to be like we are currently. And we have a mailing list, as you know. We would announce our meetings publicly. We would only do this for 6 months at the beginning. It's not supposed to be like a forever program. And then the expected outputs, basically, this potential suggestion for the IETF for a change, and then some supporting documents. I don't know if Stephen, you want to add anything to the proposal at this point?
No, that's fine. I see Robin has a hand up, I think. So maybe he has something to say.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Stephen. Thank you, Jari. Yes, it was just a quick comment because Jari used the word trust, which is fine. It always rings a small bell when I hear it. Do we trust this endpoint? Because at some point in the document, we will have to make clear, and to be fair, it may already exist. We'll have to make clear what we mean by trust there, and usually it's simply a matter of completing the phrase. We trust or don't trust this endpoint to do X. And once you get to that point, then you've got a workable definition. But if it's just trust as an uncompleted predicate, then it's hard to get anything. It's hard to get anything actionable out of it.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid comment, and I may have spoken carelessly and possibly also written carelessly. One could imagine perhaps that you can write the purpose of this exercise without using the word trust, because the point really isn't like who do we trust, but rather that you have to consider the possibility that there's an issue in the other side or even in your implementation and so on. So alerting people to that fact rather than sort of trying to be the arbiter for trust the guys versus those other guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the reason I think there's probably wording in there, there may well be wording in there that does this already, is that this is not new in the security domain. If you say that something is secure, that's useless, but you have to say.
Yeah, I'm sorry, is the idea that agents misbehave somehow supposed to be news?
Sorry, could you repeat? I missed that.
Yeah, I said, I'm finding this discussion a little puzzling. Is the idea that agents in the network misbehave supposed to be somehow news?
No,
I think it's
no, not news. But if we're trying to describe a threat model, and we're couching it in terms of, for instance, a reduction in the extent to which we feel we can trust endpoints. All I'm saying is that we should probably specify what it is that we are trusting endpoints to do or not do. And that may be as general a statement as this endpoint cannot be trusted to fulfill the function you expect of it.
Well, I mean, I certainly agree that trust is a relative relation, but I guess I'm going back to the purpose of this giant exercise, which has been going on for quite some time now, which is to update the threat model in some way that it previously was inadequate. I'm trying to understand in what way this is supposed to be like I've heard a lot of talk about how somehow the situation is different and the endpoints are less trustworthy. And I'm trying to figure out what is supposed to be news in this conversation.
Yeah, I don't think I'm pointing
to new information that was not available to us 15 years ago.
I don't think I'm pointing to a new problem. I'm just observing
but I'm saying
that
the effort is predicated in the idea there is one.
Okay, in that case,
so,
I think it's tangential to the point I was making.
I don't. We're saying that there's a new problem per se. I mean, in theory, all of this is well known, but I think there's a new situation in the sense that perhaps in the past, getting communication security right was, hugely important. Now, when that's in a lot of cases, it's much better handled, and we have some other issues to tackle, and alerting people to the fact that, hey, in protocol design, you also have to consider these aspects. That's the issue we're trying to deal with here.
I guess what I'm trying to get is, what are those aspects?
From my perspective, that's the question of what kind of threats arise on from endpoints that may misbehave for one or other reason.
This gets back to my question, which is I mean, I've been doing this a long time, and so have you. And the idea that there's malware in people's computers is not news. It's goes back to how old any virus? How old is the Morris worm? So again, what's the news?
My personal opinion is that the current text in 3552 sort of seems to discourage the thinking too much into these issues, and I would rather change that text. I'm not asking for a huge change. I also recognize that you commented on the mailing list, I think, that there are other topics that you would like to change in 3552 if you had a chance. Not suggesting that those would not be sensible changes either, but I do think that the current emphasis could perhaps be changed.
So okay, well, so I guess I'd like to understand what people think that means, because I think the text there is correct, which is to say that the situation is essentially hopeless when an endpoint is compromised, and so I guess I feel like this has been going on for quite some time, and I've heard this argument made by you and other people a number of times. I'm trying to understand what actual text change you want to make, because if you think that text is incorrect, I'd like to understand how. And if you think that text should be oh, well, endpoints actually are compromised a lot more often than you think, okay, fine. But what is the actual change you want to make?
Well, I do think that there are things to do. It's not entirely hopeless. And secondly, we do have text proposals. Actually, we could get to that at some point on this call also. And I also sent some additional texts just before the call.
I agree that the assumption that that you have just to assume that every endpoint is completely compromised is not how we design protocols today. We have different roles where we have different trust in the entities, and that's not reflected in the current document.
I just don't agree with that statement. We don't assume the endpoints are completely compromised. What I said was that the idea that there are degrees of compromise is not actually really that commensurate with the way protocol design proceeds. Typically, when we said which we were to be compromised is temporality. Yes, PCS, and then I guess very occasionally we worry about things like key exfiltration versus non-key exfiltration. But these are like, I mean, this is getting very deep into like, and that's a very deep technical, like ComSec stuff. Is those the changes you want to make? Do you want to talk about key exploitation? You want to have PCS and PFS? Like, what are the changes you want to make?
So Eric, I think there are, I do think there are changes that could be beneficial. I don't think we know what they are yet, and I think that's okay. It sounds a bit like you're looking for the results before we've done the kind of analysis together.
Well, sure. I guess I'm surprised that we've gotten this far with the claim that a bunch of changes need to be made without having a clear idea what this change, a clear proposal what this change is on.
Again, we have text proposals from several people, but you know, maybe they're not the right ones, and that's why we're having this discussion. It's not like we have a blank sheet of paper.
Yeah, I think we could make proposals that would fill tens of pages of text, but I don't think that would be useful. So I think the challenge for me, it seems, is to try and see, is there something that we can reduce and make it generic enough that it would be useful? But I don't think there's a problem with saying that you could add an awful lot more to that one paragraph that's in BCP 72 today.
No, I agree. You could like incorporate like all Schneider. I agree with that.
Right. So I think the challenge for this group is, can we condense into something useful as an update to BCP 72? And I don't think we know the answer is yes or no yet, personally.
I actually did send at the top of the call a proposal for 3 different options, like, you know, this very minimal thing, essentially a single sentence and another change sentence, or that and some additional things, or a very lengthy guideline about stuff like some of the things that you talked about, Ecker, PX and so forth. But I'm more on the minimal side personally. But we have also gone quite far from the original topic of this first section of the agenda, which was about the organization. If we get back to that for a brief moment, so we wanted to get, I mean, there's also already been some discussion on the mailing list. I would like to get your feedback today. If you think our plan is acceptable or crazy, and if the model is somehow acceptable, then Steven and I can work with the IAB to figure out how to create a program. And we have, in the meantime, also requested a meeting time in Vancouver for an hour or a half. Feedback on whether that's a suitable thing to do would also be useful, and the length of time. Any comment on that at this point?
So, hi, this is Dirk. So in general, I think it would be good to have that program, but I also have to agree to Ecker to some extent that it may actually not be optimal to focus this activity so much on updating BCP 72, because I think the discussion has shown that most of the threats that people seem to have in mind have little to do with communication security, for example, and the other objectives in BCP 72, because the threats are mostly about endpoints that behave perfectly fine regarding communication security. They're just not doing what the user expects, and this is probably really difficult to capture in BCP 72-like text. So I'm not, say, 100% negative that we cannot come up with something useful, but I think it could be productive to first articulate those threats more, and you know, make the goal of this effort finding out whether there's something useful that we can add to BCP 72.
And I think that's largely the plan, and maybe there's been too much emphasis on the words on the update. I think the analysis part is equally important. But I think that, like, to the core of the question, I mean, of course, the situation is that you have to consider non-ComSec issues. That is the the primary advice at a high level.
Well, I mean, so I guess like maybe helpful to actually think of an example that is not this sort of endpoint one, which is, from my perspective, probably the major change in the environment in the past 10 years has been the sort of the rise of commercial surveillance via web tracking. That's probably the biggest unanticipated change that we didn't understand. That even when you understand the Dole-Dian model, it's not what you would not have realized that was going to happen. And I think that would be a really good material to cover. What would we say about that?
So, I won't try and
Kind of thing.
I won't try and give a complete answer to that, but I think one of the things we could say is that people should be considering abuse cases when designing protocols in the IETF. Not just use cases, but abuse cases.
Okay.
Not cover the abuse cases currently sufficiently, Stephen? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think in general, thinking of the specific threat Ecker mentioned, we tend to define protocols with extensibility points, and we think of how to make them work for the 2 or 3 use cases that the IETF working group is focused on. And then it turns out that somebody figures a way of abusing these protocol data units for tracking or for correlating or re-identifying. And we hadn't thought about those kind of abuse cases at protocol design time. So I think that particular change is one that seems attractive to me now. Whether if we thought it through some more, whether it would pan out to be something actually useful enough to put into an update, I don't know. But I think that's something to explore.
So I would actually suggest that, in a previous conversation, and I apologize, I don't remember whether it was in this group or a different group, we described this as the current description is of an omnipotent attacker. We've gotten to the point, both on the commercial side and with kind of the per-pass stuff, of realizing that some of these attackers are also omnipresent. And so our sense of what's actually going to the attacker has to be updated with an understanding that they may be cross-correlating data visible only across many different flows. So if you think about the communication security on a per flow basis, you'll be missing this class of attacks. And I think that's something that we definitely can explore. And I think it's very difficult in that situation to think about what the abuse is, because the attack itself is the data leakage, and then what somebody does with the attack is the abuse. And I think that's, or what somebody does with leaked data is the abuse. So I think there's a piece here where if we can describe the results of this new piece of information about the attacker, it may help people think through what the abuse cases are, and it may change what we put in individual flows.
So the problem then is that not just that endpoints are compromised, but in some cases you need to communicate with an endpoint that may in some respects be hostile. Because the cross correlation is happening largely by, maybe e-commerce sites or things that you're communicating with.
So that's certainly one class of these where the omnipresence is achieved by collusion, but there are other classes of them where it's achieved in other ways.
Ted, I guess maybe the difference here doesn't make this point as sharp as it should be, but the Dole-Dian threat model assumes complete access to the network everywhere on the network. So this is not. Again, I guess I'm trying to understand how much people think the situation has changed, or how much people think the text is not good, versus how much people think that the material that we have to cover. Those are all the different things. And I guess maybe you and I had a conversation previously where we were well, that wasn't obvious to everybody, but that seems I feel like that's generally obvious to the communication security community. But maybe it's a matter of things aren't clear. I mean, the web tracking
It
thing
might
I think is a
actually be-
different example. Go ahead.
So I think it might actually be useful at some point to get to the actual text proposals also as examples at least. So discussing this in the abstract may be difficult. I
That's why I
think
said the
the
web tracking
theory
thing,
hasn't
right?
changed.
That's why I asked about the web tracking thing, right? Because I mean, like, one could imagine writing like a page and a half about like how web tracking works and how that's a privacy threat, and like how you have to think about that and reason about that when you're building systems. And like that would be like a very appropriate like piece of material for someone, for someone in some forum. I'm trying to figure out the field, that'd be appropriate material for this forum, because that will help me guide my thinking.
Yeah, I think that's a topic, and there are similar things that could be dealt in an analysis document. I think there might be some people who think that we should put a lot of material in a 3552 type document. I'm not one of those persons. I only want to change the emphasis there a little bit. It seems to discourage currently some of the avenues for issues, and I'd like to change that personally. But if I try to summarize the discussion on the organization piece, then I didn't hear a lot of objection for this IAB path. I did hear a discussion about like, how much do we focus on the analysis and gathering data and advice and so on versus this 3552 thing. And that's of course fair game for discussion. So maybe if unless somebody screams, the organization part, go ahead. And then we would actually move forward in this call to the technical discussion, which we in practice have already been having. So, Stephen, how would you like to continue that part?
I guess. Yeah, if you go to the slide that says the kind of expected outputs from the program text. Okay, so I think, Ecker, are you just on phone or can you also see the screen?
I can see the screen. I'm just on the phone for technical reasons.
Right. So I guess the expected outputs. So we talked a bit about possible updates BCP 72. I think other documents, perhaps on the nature of the kind of one you mentioned about web tracking, would be good outputs, and whether we produce RFCs or just internet drafts that wither away, that kind of justify or try to explain or explore threat models. I think there's scope there for explanatory kind of material that would be just too verbose and too specific for BCP 72. And that's like most of the text in the draft Gary and I wrote. So I guess I'd like to ask, do people feel that they would work on these kind of outputs? And when we asked that in Vancouver, a bunch of people said yes, and the holidays happened and not much happened on this topic. So is this a reasonable set of things on which to try and get us to work? And again, just another point is I think as a kind of a mode of operation, I think it would be entirely fine for people to just work independently, and later on we can see how much commonality there is and whether documents should be merged or whatever. I don't think we should be trying to just work on one document at this point. So, does that set of expected outputs look like a useful thing? Is my question.
Well, I mean, I guess the resistance you're hearing from me, Stephen, is this seems to really focus on this sort of like BCP 72 and new threat model question, and like, but I don't see like that seems. But then I just got told that like the thing I think is most interesting, which is like actually explaining what the implications are in the current environment, is like not in scope for that discussion. So no, I don't think this is. I think focusing on updates to 72 is like the most important thing. Is wrong thing. I mean, the right thing to do is focus on actually describing the threat environment, and that includes not just threat model, but also what people are actually doing in the world. And then once we've done that, we can determine whether or not some update to 72 is required.
Okay, I know I don't have a problem with that, but so that suggests like rewording at least that last bullet to say, to say not explaining new threat models, but the threat environment and possible new threat models, maybe.
Well, I guess I'm sort of like, I mean, do you think web tracking is a change in the threat model?
Sorry, say again?
Do you think web tracking is a change in the threat model?
Yes.
Okay, well, that's helpful because I wasn't clear that was true.
I mean, you could, you know, it's a pause, then yes. So I think web tracking at the scale and across the number of applications and platforms and so on, as it happens today, is not even hinted at by the current threat model.
Oh, I 100% agree. I 100% agree.
I think there's more to be said there. Whether it, you know, to what extent you cast as a new threat model, I don't know. But yeah, I think there's definitely more to be said.
Yeah, I think that came out. Certainly, I have a vague recollection that came out in the discussion in Singapore, in connection also with the threat represented by linkability. I think those surfaced at the same time in the discussion.
So this is all beginning to sound to me like a, you know, listening to all the issues and complaints, and you know, it sounds almost like a program that a lot of people think is too big. And I think that one of the easiest ways around that would be to structure the charter, or whatever we call the program text, such that it really becomes sort of a phased type approach, right? If you want to concentrate on, let's define the environment first and then come back and figure out how to update, you know, BCP 72 with a model afterwards. I think that sounds like a really good approach, but I would structure the bullets that way so that we walk through stuff and maybe include an example. And, you know, if the web-based example is a good one to start thinking about, include that as a such as, to try and get a more structured flow. I mean, the meeting in Singapore was great, but it was all over the map too. And that's the thing I worry about this program.
Okay, and then go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my perspective, what's happened is that like you know, we have a set of you know, underlying assumptions that, you know, people have historically made about the way that, like, you have to reason about security. And then two things have happened. One is that the operating environment in which those assumptions have to be applied has, like, changed radically from when 3552 is written, both in terms of, you know, the rise of the web and the rise of cloud computing and decentralized operation, or I guess maybe centralized, but distributed, the same, you know, the way AWS is. That's the first thing. And the second thing is we've got a much clearer understanding of how to actually reason about the security properties of the systems from those first principles. And that goes back to, like, you know, things like PFS, which is like barely understood when this is written, and PCS, which is like not understood at all when this is written, and things like append-only logs, and like just how to reason about those things. So I think those are the two things from my perspective really changed. And like actually, like, you know, whether you call it a threat model or not, really could do with some explanation, because they're clearly not present in 3552. I mean, they weren't even contemplated. So from my perspective, those are the things. It's like I would like, if we're going to do something, I would most like to see get out on the table, because those would actually be helpful. People reading it might be like, hey, you know, now you're like designing a protocol, like you should be thinking of these things, which like we didn't really understand you guys were thinking about back then. And I'm certainly willing to read text on some of those things if people think those are valuable, because I think those are simply like, you know, if a new protocol designer came to me and was like, hey, I want to start designing conflict protocols on IETF, I'd be like, these are things that you actually have to know. But maybe people think those are boring, in which case I won't do anything.
Well, Ecker, did I hear you volunteering to do something there?
Yeah. I'd be willing to. The two things I'm willing to do is I'm willing to write up I'm willing to write some material on like web tracking, a page or two, and I'm willing to write up a page or two. Though I'm actually going to try to draft Chris to help me with this on, you know, sort of like modern reasoning about protocol security, especially based on things like endpoint compromise, but also based on thinking about like, you know, how we reason about what the statements we want to make about security are. And I think, you know, it's pretty clear, like, I mean, just to elaborate on that for 1 second, it's like really clear that like the way we designed TLS 1.3 and the way we're designing MLS like radically different from the way that like SW3 or S9 were designed, and they come out by different principles and different handles of operation, and those are things people we benefit from knowing. So I'm willing to like write a total basically 3 pages of material on those 2 topics that people think will be valuable. If it's not valuable, I'm happy to not reflect them on you.
I would find that extremely valuable.
Yeah, I think that would be good.
Okay. Well, then I will attempt to produce something.
Okay, and then just trying to broaden it out a bit. Who else on the call who was either at the meeting in Vancouver or not, or sorry, in Singapore, or not, or wasn't, thinks that they would be able to work on something along these lines, let's say between now and Vancouver, noting that the deadline for internet drafts is March 9th.
I can help Ecker with that.
That was Chris. Great, thank you. And yeah, Robin says, does work on review or comment? I'm assuming everybody would comment probably, but I'm more asking who would write text or update drafts. So I think, yeah, Yari's put up a list of things that we said in Singapore. I think it'd be good to know how many of these might be updated between now and Vancouver. Dominique says yes, I will. I assume you mean update your draft.
Yeah. Yep.
Hi, this is Ali. Indeed, we will work on collating some data of the threats, and just to be able to provide a basis for examples if certain things could have been in the recommendations, protocols could have patched up some holes that existed current specifications. So I'll work on that. And if people can throw examples, then it would be also good.
So I just noticed that Ali, the slide says CDE. I think what you were planning to do was have a look at CVEs and see which ones would be relevant in the IETF context.
Absolutely.
So if you're looking at the slide, instead of CDE, it should be CVE.
No. Yes, I think we corrected that with Robin, but maybe it didn't. Yeah, indeed, CDE. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't take I took the original one.
Okay, no problem. Thank you.
So we had did somebody take a note of all of those volunteering actions in the minutes, or Robin, are you doing that now? Or?
No, I don't think I was. I jotted down. I think I captured Ecker's 2 or 3 points in the chat.
So if whoever is helping with anonymously helping with the Etherpad minutes could try and capture who volunteered for what, that'd be great.
So what I heard was from Mark, Dominic, Ali, and Robin. I didn't hear anything from Melinda or Karsten. Did I miss somebody?
Sure.
He was already in the Etherpad.
I don't think Melinda's on the call.
Ted, there's a note from Mark McFadden in the chat. He says he'll work on updating the class on endpoint taxonomy before Vancouver.
Thank you.
So Yari, you had if you go back to the agenda, I guess. So Yari and I had updated the draft we wrote. Just out of interest, has anybody had a chance to look at that? I did get some comments about typos and stuff, but it's not hugely different. It's definitely fairly flaky in places. But if there's any comments on it or anything in there that people would like to bring up now or other issues, that'll be good. So Any other technical issues we want to cover right now? And let's imagine we want to finish the call, I guess, within, we had a 2-hour slot, but I think an hour is usually enough for these things, unless we end up going on and on. So what other technical discussion would people like to raise now? And you can raise your hand in the WebEx chat or just yell.
This is this is Jim. One thing that's maybe a little bit orthogonal to all of this that's been kind of a sore point with 3552 for me is that people put normative requirements in there. I would like the security requirement section to be just descriptive of the protocol that was previously described, and not try and put normative requirements in there just because I'm afraid that they're going to be missed.
So just to recap, you'd like documents not to have security considerations that have 2119 language in them. I mean, that's
no 2119. No 2119 language in the security considerations.
So I think that's absolutely right, but I fear we have to have the ISG do that work.
Yeah, I also suspect that opinions might be all over the place on that one. But yeah, that would definitely be something for, you know, that's definitely an IETF and not a kind of an architecturally type thing. So
yeah, just that
for whatever it's worth, Go ahead.
Just if we're doing a 3552 BIS, that I would like that to be in there. That's all.
Well, I certainly agree with your sentiment. At least personally, but I also agree with Stephen that this is probably outside our scope. We could deliver some suggested text for one technical thing for the IETF. If the IETF wants to update the full RFC and take care of all issues, then that seems like another task. We're really interested in this technical aspect here.
Fair enough.
Okay, so asking this kind of the same questions I asked last time in a different way. Is there anything here is there anything that, if you look at the set of drafts that people have written, ours and the other ones, is there anything that's totally missing that really should be considered? Well, like, you know, we don't say, I don't think anybody says much about routing, for example.
Well, I do recall, Stephen, at one point we were going to declare bankruptcy on routing security. Is that still on the table?
Who's going to do the liquidation? That's my question.
No, Stephen was going to write it. I think Stephen was going to write documents saying everything is terrible. We're not going to fix it.
I think one of the things that is probably in the category of the people who know this know it very well, but the people who don't know this don't realize it's common, is that it's very, very common right now for there to be more than one routing plane involved. Not just at there's MPLS encapsulating your IP, but the service function chaining has kind of radically altered how flows travel in a lot of situations. And I don't think that has a bunch of implications for the ComSec, but it does mean that if you have any illusions that something about your path selection is protecting you from anything, you are almost certainly wrong, because your visibility into the path selection is almost certainly limited to one of those routing planes. I don't think that
seems like a good. Sorry.
Go ahead.
That seems like a good example of like something that'd be really good to like explain, but people don't really know.
Yeah, so it's something I think, you know, when you're thinking about routing security, part of the problem is how do you work out what's the interaction among the routing security at sort of service function chaining levels and at MPLS or IP layers. because the interactions among them are controlled by different parties. And often the person who manages the service function chaining doesn't have any control over the IP routing, as an example, or vice versa. So there's definitely a set of things, you know, there's a bunch of people who are involved in this who know this really well, but then there's a bunch of people who are like, wait, what? And if I see something that would be useful to write up here, or if I can come up with the time to do it, that's something I might try and contribute.
Ted, I agree with everything you said, but it's also often the case, depending on what the motivation of the attacker is, that they don't want to mess with the routing system because they need it to work to exfil the data.
I think in this field in general, we try to differentiate between misrouting, interference with routing, et cetera, and gaming the routing protocols themselves. And I think some of the current work is the latter, and is service chaining is not part of the threat there.
Just to confirm my understanding, you're saying that you don't think that service chaining is being gamed in the way other parts of the routing is? Is that what you meant?
The protocols being used are not being gamed. Part of, let's try it from the task level. Part of what we would ask of a protocol is protection against it being gamed in a service chaining situation. Though I fear I'm descending to 1,000 meters. I don't want to really get into details, but all I'm saying is differentiate between misusing the protocol and the protocol itself having a problem that's being attacked. But I agree with whoever said routing's fucked.
Yeah, that's one of the things that is. But I think we can agree very easily that the attack surface for this routing type things has increased significantly. So previously we had, well, essentially one or a couple secure systems, and now we have many. And they're also differentiated in different ways in the control of other parties. So the surface has increased both in terms of what layer it is and what technical part, but also in terms of, you know, whose hands it is in, and so on. And ComSec, of course, protects some of against some of this, but not entirely.
So this kind of comes back to a question I put in the chat a little earlier, which is whether, I mean, up until now, a lot of the discussion has been about endpoints and untrustworthy endpoints. And this is more about untrustworthy intermediary points, isn't it? And therefore, whether you can build a trustworthy service if, for the sake of argument, you trust the endpoints, but you don't trust any of the points in between. Sorry, that wasn't a question. So the question would be, does that mean that intermediary node trustworthiness is in scope for what we're doing here?
It seems to be covered by existing things to a large extent, I guess, because ComSec and because denial of service, we knew that that's a possibility. Of course, I mean, this is an interesting case of an intermediary. It's not like your typical NAT or firewall, but it's just network infrastructure is more complex and error prone today than it was perhaps in the past.
And does that cover Randy's entities that game the system, routing system? So then you're not necessarily talking about changing the functionality of the intermediary nodes. Something a kind of analogy for this is the guys who recently put 50 mobile handsets into a kid's handcart and wheeled them down a street, and the resulting traffic managed to persuade Google Maps that there must be a traffic jam on that street. So they haven't changed the functionality of the network, but they've gamed the system so that it produces a result that was unhelpful and untrustworthy.
That's an example of the kind of IoT attack that actually attacks the physical aspect of something. And in this case, the location of the device, which is thought to be in the pocket of somebody driving a car, and in reality is in that cart. And there are lots of attacks that can be made on the physical side of things that have interesting consequences.
With respect,
sorry, go ahead.
With respect to intermediate nodes, I mean, we often deal with that by doing end-to-end encryption and so forth, but there's also the problem that there are times when the intermediate nodes need to operate on some of the metadata, and we might be concerned about exploit of the metadata as well as the communication itself.
Yeah, and that's the issue. Like I guess one of the questions was if this is too far out of this endpoint range for our scope, and there is some linkage though, because if you can fool some of the underlying infrastructure to do some things that lets you elevate yourself, in some sense, get security credentials that make it look like you are the endpoint, and that's a problem. And I guess there are some situations where that might actually happen. So in that sense, some of these attacks do translate to endpoint concerns as well. But I'm not sure they're very different from other concerns with endpoints, that you could also have a virus, and therefore your thing might not actually work the way that you were expecting it to work.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, Jari, another thought about that is I noticed in some of the working groups there's quite a lot of relatively recent attention being paid to information-centric networking and or trusted content networks, where there's more processing going on at the nodes to, for example, build a reputation profile for a particular route or a particular node in a route. Route. So looking at this the other way around, one approach of this group might be to look at the risk assessment or the requirements expression by those trusted networking or trusted content networking groups, information-centric or trusted content networking groups, to see whether we think their requirements analysis and risk assessment makes sense, and whether they're covering things that we hadn't thought of, or whether we've thought of things they're not covering.
I guess we could ask Dirk.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a useful answer. Robin, I think these are really interesting questions. So, for example, also there are two things. So one is, so if you had a more, say, empowered forwarding model, what would that change in the relationship of endpoints and networks? And then the other question, what are the also potential additional risks that you introduce? But honestly, I think this is way beyond the scope of this discussion here. And then there are many interesting research questions, but probably that would mean a much longer running IAB program. I'm not sure we should go into this here.
Absolutely.
I guess
no, certainly not suggesting we should do that research, but perhaps look at that research and see whether it indicates that we are missing something or that they're missing something.
Yeah,
I think it's useful for us to look at things in the sense of like if we are missing something, but I also hope that like if we do some general on what kinds of things should we consider in designing protocols, that we are not in charge of applying that to every working group. That should be the working group's task, hopefully.
Right.
Principle that seems to me to crop up again and again is if you change something about the way the network works. So, for instance, if you place more reliance on information-centric networking nodes, for instance, do you open up new ways in which the network infrastructure can be gamed? And are you therefore changing the basis on which you trust the way that the network behaves?
Possibly, yes. And on the other hand, well, there's basically this trade-off in a sense that if you empower the network to do more useful things, that will also mean potentially you are relying less on overlay functionality, which in some people's thinking is also, say, one of the problems in the discussion these days. On the other hand, well, if you have more functionality, you also probably need to have more information, more, say, visibility into some metadata or something, and this could again lead to other threats. So, but it's a longer discussion. So I started actually writing up something in this direction. It's not very mature yet. That's why I didn't raise my hand earlier. It may take some more time. But thanks for bringing this up.
That's fine. It feels like there's a general principle hovering around there, of which what you describe is some of the examples. So I'll see if I can express it more clearly. Not on the call.
Okay, good. I guess unless people have any specific issues about the draft that Jari and I put out, or I'm not sure if any of the other ones were updated. Dominic, I don't think your draft is updated, but I think one of the class ones was. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I'm working on mine, and the class one, the Arno Tadai's one, was updated.
Okay, it'd be great if you maybe set a pointer to the list. Just
sure.
Yeah, that'd be good. So I only have two other questions to kind of poke us with. One is a very brief one. If we're meeting in Vancouver, would we like 60 or 90 minutes? I'm assuming 60 might be okay, but if people would rather slightly longer, then please say so. And then the second question is just a longer one, I guess, that we can think about maybe rather than answer here, is to what extent do we think covering privacy as well as security is in scope, or to what extent should we be working on that as part of this group as opposed to in general? I'd be interested in opinions on that second thing.
I think you have enough energy here that an hour and a half makes sense.
Okay, I'll update the session request for 90 minutes then. And then on the question of privacy, and then we'll get to any other business if people have any other things. So to what extent do we think that this activity should focus on privacy in IETF protocols?
I'll go back and repeat my earlier statement. I think it's actually a good idea, but I'd try and take it off as a second hunk or a later hunk, because you'll spin for too long without anything if you try and take on everything.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with Wes on that one. Having beaten my head against the privacy problem for a number of years now, I think if you approach the first piece of work with one eye on the security aspects of it and the other eye on the slightly more generic trust aspects of it, then I think that would lay the foundations for privacy work later on. So, for instance, just very generically, if you trust an intermediate node not to exfiltrate data inappropriately, then that's a trust factor you can document. You don't have to get into the privacy ramifications of whether that's trustworthy or not, but you could later on.
Hi, this is Ali. I think when we talk about privacy, it's a huge scope, but I think what would be significant for protocol designers is to be aware of threats to privacy, and that when they design protocols, they should be conservative in collecting data and minimizing the exposure. That's the kind of general guidance which I think is referred to already in the existing text, but we could try to emphasize that without going into the trust topics too much, specifically for protocol designers, because a lot of things are, a lot of privacy issues are arising because data is liberally collected, which is not absolutely needed, often as a side effect of protocol design. Maybe we can focus on that area.
So you mean it should be conservative in the opportunity to collect data, because the protocols themselves don't collect data.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, they shouldn't lead, let's say, to that kind of side effect.
Okay, I take the point about phasing and scheduling and not trying to bite off too much. It might be worth if people had another look back at RFC 6973 and see, is there stuff that isn't in there that's worth considering, or that might be worth kind of promoting into the IETF as a BCP or something like that. But just that, RFC 6973 is already an IAB output along some of those lines already. So there is some previous work to base on. So I think that kind of touches on everything I think we can kind of get done today. We got some volunteers. We have the ID cutoff date is March 9th as a reminder, so it'd be really good to get that. If we have a 90-minute session in Vancouver, just if anybody wants to kind of suggest a slot at that, then just send a mail to the list. And then I guess we're at any other business. So any other business anybody wants to raise? Sounds like not. In that case, okay, please, update stuff, post to the mailing list, and we'll talk on the mailing list and then arrange a session in Vancouver.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Sounds good. Thank you.
So, bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.